Grandpa David is going to read Wee Gillis.
Aye, this is a story about Wee Gillis. Wee Gillis lived in Scotland. His real name was Alistair Roderick Craiglechi Dalhousie Gowan Donny Gristle McMac, but that took too long to say, so everybody just called him Wee Gillis.
Grandpa, show the pictures at each page.
It's a picture of Wee Gillis looking out across the mountain. His mother's relations were all lowlanders. They stayed down in the valleys and raised long-haired cows. His father's relations were all highlanders. They stayed up in the hills and stalked stags. Wee Gillis didn't know which he wanted to be, a lowlander or a highlander.
Grandpa, hold up the book and show the pictures so the kids can see it. The other side. You know. Oh, there you go. Okay.
Now this is a picture of his his lowlander relations ridiculing the Highlanders. And they're laughing. I see they're laughing.
Oh yeah, okay.
His mother's relations all thought that his father's relations were very foolish to run and climb and creep around in the hills stalking stags. And here's a picture of his father's relations. And his father's relations all thought that his mother's relations were very silly to drive and call and milk their long-haired cows. Wee Gillis didn't know, but he watched them both, and he was cheerful and amiable. And here's a picture of his father's relations up in the hills.
Okay.
So for 1 year, he went to live in the lowlands with his mother's relations. And this he's going down the road, and he's going downhill, you see. And here is another one. Every day, he rose early and ate a large bowl of oatmeal, which they usually call porridge. And here's a picture of him eating his porridge. You know porridge? That's like in the Three Bears when they had porridge. Then he drove the long-haired cows out along the valleys, and at night he called and called them and drove them home again in time for his mother's relations to milk them. And here's a picture of him driving the cows home. Once he was getting late in getting them home. Then the relations all asked him what had kept him, and he had to tell them that the cows wouldn't come when he called. Then the relations all said that he didn't shout loud enough, and that the cows couldn't hear him through the heavy mist. And here's a picture of him, of his relations all discussing his discrepancies in cow calling. So every night, when the mists would come down over the valleys, Wee Gillis would shout a little louder than he had before. That was fine for his lungs. And by the end of the year, they were very, very strong. And here's a picture of him shouting through the mist. That's fog, you know. Mm-hmm. On the first day of the new year, Wee Gillis went up into the Highlands. That's the Highlands. And there's a picture of him going up the mountains, you see. He's just a little fellow there, and he's going up in these great big mountains. And every day, when he was up in the mountains, he rose early and ate a large bowl of oatmeal, which they called porridge, with his father's relations. And you see, he's hanging his hat on the antlers of a stag. And down in the before picture where he's eating oatmeal, he's hanging his hat on the horns of a cow. Yeah, that's because everything has to fit. Then he set out walking and crawling, running and creeping over the hills, stalking stags. And here he is creeping along, stalking a stag. what they mean by stalking is that he's trying to sneak up on them. But it doesn't look like he's carrying any weapon that he might shoot them with, but I don't know why he's stalking them if he didn't want to shoot them or something. Maybe he's got a camera and he's going to take a picture. He would hide behind thistles and sit on the heather, and sometimes he would have to be quiet for hours at a time. That you would have thought he was a stone. So he's sitting very quietly there and still. Once while he was stalking, he sighed a big sigh because he had stayed still for so long. And the noise that it made frightened the stag so that it ran away. Then the relations all told Wee Gillis that he didn't keep quiet enough and that he must learn to hold his breath. See, they're scolding him and telling him how he should hold his breath. So day after day, sitting among the thistles and on the heather, Wee Gillis would hold his breath longer and longer to keep from sighing so he wouldn't frighten the stags. That was fine for his lungs, and by the end of the year they were very, very strong. And here's a picture of him holding his breath. So year in and year out, Wee Gillis would take turns calling the cows in the lowlands and stalking the stags in the highlands. And all the while his lungs grew stronger and stronger. And you can tell by looking at this picture how strong his lungs are because his chest is sticking way out. At last the day came when he must make up his mind and decide forever which to be, a lowlander who called cows or a highlander who stalked stags. Bright and early in the morning, there were two loud knocks on his door. When he opened it, there stood his Uncle Andrew from the lowlands and his Uncle Angus from the heathlands. Gillis put up his kilt in a hurry, and away they went out into the morning. And here's a picture of them going off. They walked and walked, not saying a word, down through the valleys and up over the hills, until they found just the right spot for deciding. Then his Uncle Andrew and his Uncle Angus stopped and stood very still. They turned to Wee Gillis. He was exactly halfway up the side of a medium-sized hill, not in the lowlands and not in the highlands, just in the middle. And he had to choose forever. And there they are confronting him, and he has to make up his mind. Gillis looked down, and Gillis looked up. Then he looked at his uncles, and they began to talk. And here they are now trying to convince him which to do. First they pleaded, and then they begged, very softly and very quietly, one at a time, and they politely waited for each to finish what he had to say before the other began. But still Wee Gillis could not decide. Well, they were polite, all right, but they didn't look very, very cheerful about the whole thing. At least this fellow, his father's relations, looked rather kind of like he's mad about something. So the uncles' voices grew louder and louder, and they didn't wait for each other to finish talking anymore, but shouted and screamed and yelled until they jumped up and down and stamped their feet. See the picture of them jumping up and down, stamping their feet like Rumpelstiltskin? You could hear them shouting all the way down in the valley and all the way up in the hills. Yes, we have pictures of people who could hear them and hear all the commotion going on. Suddenly his uncle stopped jumping and shouting because a very large man had come up behind them. he was carrying something brown and big, but he put it down beside a rock, and then he looked at Wee Gillis, and then at Uncle Andrew, and then at Uncle Angus. When they were very quiet, he sat down on a rock. And he picked up the big brown thing that looked like a sack with sticks in it, and took a deep breath and puffed his cheeks and shut his eyes and blew into one end of it with all his might. And here he is blowing and blowing with all his might. But nothing happened. He shook his head sadly and tried again, but nothing happened. And then he was very sad, and he said so. He was almost ready to cry because he was a bagpiper, and he had just made these fine new bagpipes to play on. But he had made them too big, and he didn't have breath enough to blow them. And here he is. He's almost ready to cry. Uncle Andrew was very sorry for him. So he tried to blow him, but he couldn't. There is Uncle Andrew trying to blow the big bagpipe. Uncle Angus was sorry for him too. So he tried to blow them, but neither could he. And there's a picture of him trying to blow them. So they all sat down on rocks. Seems like they didn't have anything else to sit on around there. So they all sat down on rocks and were sad together. Wee Gillis wished his uncles would ask him to try, but they didn't. So he just stood and looked as though he would like to. After a long time, the large man noticed him and shook his head slowly. But because Wee Gillis looked so wanting to the large man, he asked him if he would like to try. Wee Gillis said, "Aye," so he did. First, he took a deep breath, the way he used to when he was going to call the cows on a misty night in the lowlands. And here's a picture of him taking a deep breath. Then he held it the way he used to when he was sitting very still stalking stags in the highlands. And here he is now holding his breath and getting ready to blow. And then he blew with all the force in his very, very strong lungs. The bag filled up and let out a screech through every one of its pipes. And the large man and Uncle Andrew and Uncle Angus fell off their rocks with surprise. See how big it is, the big, big bags, and Wee Gillis could blow it. So the large man taught him how to make music, and now Wee Gillis is welcome down in the lowlands and up in the highlands. But most of the time he just stays in his house halfway up the side of a medium-sized hill and plays the biggest bagpipe in all Scotland. Now there's a picture of him sitting there in his chair and blowing on the bagpipe. Now isn't that a nice story?
And that was Grandpa David reading Wee Gillis.
Ach, aye. You see, it's a broblich, moonlich, nick the next. And the answer is, ach, aye. There's dule amang the hither and twa moons in the sky. Dougal, Donald, Blackie, Ronald, Alec, Jack and Tom. Wipe the glibber frae your boots and come on here, dram. That's an old saying.
Okay.